All right, we're on Matthew 14:13. Matthew 14:13. So at the beginning of chapter 14, Jesus was just informed about John the Baptist's death. And kind of like a flashback, he hears about John the Baptist's death. And then it says in 14:13, it says, when Jesus heard it meaning about John the Baptist's death, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. So he wanted to get away. He wanted to go and pray to his father. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. So it seems that they were on the Sea of Galilee, the Lake of Galilee, and Jesus departs by boat up to the northeastern side of the Sea of Galilee, but which was about 4 miles walk. And so the multitudes heard, and somehow they found out where he was going, and they walked 4 miles to follow him to this place. So verse 14. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude. So in other words, when he got out of the boat, already a great multitude was there. So they had walked the 4 miles and beat him there. And he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. So in other words, he saw the effort they went to see him. And even though he was trying to be by himself to get some rest and pray, he feels compassion for them and the effort that they put in. So he heals their sick. 15. When it was evening, his disciples came to him saying, this is the deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away to the Capernaum, which was probably one of the larger villages around the Sea of Galilee, located on the shores of the Galilee. We think best we're talking about 5,000 men plus women and children. So you could be talking about 20,000 people who are following Jesus in this multitude. And so if one of the largest villages around is only 2,500 people, and you have 20,000 people who are hungry, it's not like you can just stop in at Walmart there if you want. It would be difficult. 20,000 people show up in a small village. They probably don't have enough food to sell. So the disciples are legitimately worried because these people, it's already getting late, it's getting dark, they're gonna have to walk to multiple villages in order to find food. So they have a legitimate concern that they're expressing to Jesus. And in 16, it said, but Jesus said to them, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. And they said to him, we have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish. He said, bring them here to me. Then he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass. And there the word is recline on the grass. It's not sit down, because in the ancient world at this time, they would eat reclining. They would lay on their side with their head propped up on their arm. So I don't know why it always translates it sit down. In other words, to make it more like we're used to, but that's not what it says. So in other words, they eat. They lie down and they recline in groups and they get ready to eat. So in here, you have different. We know what's coming up here because we've read this about to multiply the loaves, and so there's this miraculous feeding of the 5,000. But it's not that this comes out of nowhere, but this comes from, in the Old Testament, there were miraculous feedings as well. The most famous is the manna that came down from heaven in the wilderness. But also, I want to read to you, there were miracles performed at the hands of prophets, especially Elisha in 2 Kings. So here's what it says in 2 Kings 4:42. Then a man came from Baal Shalisha and brought to the man of God, Elisha, the first fruits, a religious offering, which were 20 loaves of barley bread and fruit cake. And he said, Elisha said, give it to the people and let them eat. But his servant said, why shall I set this before 100 men? In other words, it's 20 loaves. It's not enough to feed 100 men that were there. So he's saying, it would be crazy to set, like let's say all of us were together at a meal and I set out one little bowl of peanuts or something, right? It's not enough. So the servant objects, why shall I set this before 100 men? Now Elisha said, give it to the people and let them eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and will leave some behind. So this is a Not only is there a miracle before that the prophet Elisha does, but also there's a prophetic saying from the Lord, they shall eat and will leave some behind, which is exactly what's going to happen now. So it says, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitudes. So here the church fathers always point out that in this feeding and in the second feeding, which is coming up, it specifically says in the gospel that Jesus gave it to the disciples and the disciples distributed it to the people. And so, of course, the church always sees this as the role of the clergy in distributing communion, right? So no, everyone doesn't just take it themselves, but it comes from the disciples. The Lord blesses it, then the disciples give it to the people.
Absolutely.
All right, so Jesus in this blessing performs the role of the father at a typical Jewish meal. So the blessing would have been the traditional Jewish blessing made before meals, which says, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." This blessing is followed by the breaking of the bread and the distribution of the pieces. So, and then, of course, we all recognize that this language points forward to the Last Supper, to the Eucharist. Has anyone here seen The Chosen?
Yep.
I recommend it. It's good. You guys should, have you seen it?
Not yet.
It's good, but in there,
I don't go to the moon.
it shows,
They show it on
You have to
TV.
wait on it shows on TV.
yeah,
They
on-
show it on there
they
once in a
show-
while, not too often, but.
Yeah.
Every-
this one isn't on there.
yeah, every meal that they do in that show, they start
They
off,
advertise
they
it.
start off with, "Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth."
Yeah,
So
but-
that was the traditional blessing. All right, then it says in verse 20, so they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments that remained. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. All right, so here in Matthew, the first feeding, this is the first feeding of the 5,000, then there's going to be a second feeding of the 4,000. And this first feeding follows the flashback about the death of John the Baptist, right? Which we just read in the last class, although it seems to us it's been a while ago in our class, but it just happened in the gospel. And that's important because Matthew is possibly trying to make a juxtaposition between the banquet that took place at Herod's that was full of pride and arrogance, scheming and murder, and taking place at this royal palace. And then you have Jesus's banquet in the middle of the wilderness, in the middle of the desert, where there's healing, trust, and sharing. So there's these two parallel banquets going on, one in which the elite of the world end up killing John the Baptist, and this one where the poor and Jesus are, which ends up being a miraculous event. And the meal points beyond, the meal points out of this world to the kingdom of God. And a familiar Old Testament example of this is Isaiah 25:6. And there it says, "The Lord of hosts will prepare a lavish banquet for all peoples on this mountain, a banquet of aged wine, choice pieces with marrow, and refined aged wine." So again, there's this prophecy about the Lord hosting this banquet for his people. And this is what Jesus is doing. 14:22. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. So again, now he was trying to get away to get some rest after all this healing. They follow him. He has compassion on them. He heals them. He teaches them, and then he feeds them, and then he dismisses them, and he tries to get away again. And according to John chapter 6, a parallel account of this miraculous feedings, the crowds, this 20,000 people were so enthusiastic about the miracle of the feeding that they just experienced that they wanted to take Jesus right there and make him king. Right? And so this is why Jesus dismisses them, and immediately he gets in a boat and goes away because he doesn't want them to make him a king yet. 23. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. So finally he gets away. Now when evening came, he was alone there, but the boat was now in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, the lake, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And we know that in the Sea of Galilee, up until this day, harsh storms often arise suddenly. So it can look like everything's clear, and then all of a sudden, because it's located in this valley, all of a sudden a wind whips down into the valley, and it stirs up a storm on the sea. So it says, now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. So fourth watch, the Romans divided the night up into 4 watches, 4 3-hour blocks. The Jews had 3 watches of the night. They divided it slightly differently, but here he's using the Roman accounting. So in the fourth watch of the night, which would be 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m., Jesus went to them walking on the sea. He doesn't, and St. John Chrysostom says, notice that that all of a sudden that the boat was already in trouble. Then Jesus starts to walk to them. And St. John Chrysostom says he did not come quickly to the disciples' rescue, because he was training them by their fear and instructing them to be ready to endure. And then an interesting thing here is Moses, Joshua, Elijah, and Elisha had all done water miracles, parting the sea or the river Jordan. But the only one the Old Testament said trod upon the waters was God himself. In Job 9:8, it says God, he alone spreads out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. So here, taking this saying from Job, Matthew wants to show that Jesus really is God. He can walk on the waters, just like Job had said God could do. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out for fear. So even though ghosts weren't a part of official Jewish teaching, a lot of people still believed in ghosts or disembodied spirits, kind of like today when we're supposedly a Christian country, but a lot of people believe in ghosts and UFOs and whatever else. So here's an example where they have this kind of common belief that contradicted official doctrine in ghosts. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." And when he says it is I, that could be translated as I am, which is Jesus says this, especially in the Gospel of John, but also in the other Gospels. Jesus sometimes says I am in response to a question, because it can mean, okay, yeah, I am, it is I, it's me, but it also is the God's self-revelation in Exodus 3:14 when he says, "I am who I am." This I am is a divine saying. He's identifying himself possibly as God by saying this. 14:28, and Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So Peter wasn't so sure that it was really Jesus. He was thinking maybe it was a demonic deception of some kind. So he asks for this proof. "If it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So Jesus said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him, and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. So some fathers here compare the boat to the church. We're safe from storms when we're inside the boat with Jesus, and a lot of times the church compares the church itself to a boat. Like Noah's Ark is often cited as an analogy to the church, where all people and animals come in to be saved from the flood of sin. So here also the fathers see this boat as an icon of the church.
I think of Peter walking on the water and the ascetics and the saints that have been out in the desert and places like that where they have a vision come to them
Yeah,
and they question it.
yeah, yeah. And St. Paul says, I forget which epistle, but he says, test the spirits, because the angels or demons can disguise themselves as angels of light. So the fathers, especially the desert fathers, warn us to be wary. So Peter's not wrong here and questioning whether this is really Jesus or not, thinking maybe I could be being deceived. 33. And then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So again, this image of the boat as the church, the church is where we worship Jesus as the Son of God, and it's in the boat they worship him as the Son of God. 34. When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent out into all that surrounding region, brought to him all who were sick, and begged him that they might only touch the hem of his garment. And as many as touched it were made perfectly well. So Saint Hilary of Poitiers says here, as from the hem of the entire garment, the whole power of the Holy Spirit came forth from our Lord Jesus Christ. This power was given to the apostles, who were also going out, as it were, from the same body. And this power afforded healing to those who wished to touch the garment. So it's only by touch. It doesn't say anything about, I mean, it's implied that they have faith because they go to him, but simply touching Jesus's garment is enough to heal them, just like the woman with the issue of blood who touched his garment. So there's this idea that physically touching Jesus has this power in it, which is, when the church looks at passages like this, it confirms the church's view that the Holy Eucharist, communion, is really the body and blood of Christ. And when we not only touch it, but ingest it, we're made well, we're healed. All right, that's into 14. The beginning of 15, chapter 15, verse 1. Then the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus. So from Jerusalem, so several, even by car now, I think it's like 3 hours. So, it's over 100 miles from Jerusalem to Galilee. So the scribes and Pharisees from Jerusalem came to Jesus saying, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. So the tradition of the elders is the oral tradition, which they claimed came from Moses, but wasn't written down. And this included all the Pharisees' interpretations of the law. They claimed that they came from Moses to give them authority. But Jesus, and what they're talking about in particular here is they did not wash their hands when they eat bread. So in the Old Testament, in Exodus 30:19, the priests are required to wash their hands before they offer a sacrifice, which actually we still do. And now, as part of our getting ready for the liturgy, we wash our hands, which is coming from this Exodus 30:19. But the Pharisees, as they had done in general, not just in this particular case, but generally, they took the purity laws that applied to the priests and they extended them to apply to everybody. So even though the Old Testament says only the priests have to wash their hands before offering sacrifice, the Pharisees had applied it to all people before they eat. So this wasn't in the Old Testament. This was part of their oral tradition coming supposedly from Moses.
Well, that's where we got that tradition. That's why I wash my hands.
So Jesus answered and said to them, why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, so here Jesus brings up another one of their traditions, which he says contradicts the law of God, the Old Testament. For God commanded, saying, honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God, then he need not honor his father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. All right, so what's he talking about here? Okay, again, according to this oral tradition of the Pharisees, there was a kind of a loophole. So honoring your father and mother was considered by Judaism in general as perhaps the most important commandment. So you know how people ask Jesus, what's the most important commandment? And he says, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. But actually many scholars, rabbinic rabbis, Jewish scholars would actually argue at that time that honor your father and mother was the most important of all the commandments. And part of that meant supporting them in their old age, meant caring for them financially. But what the Pharisees had done is they had made this part of this oral tradition was that a person could dedicate some possession of his exclusively to God. So let's say he had a farm, a piece of farmland. He could say, I'm dedicating this farmland to God, to sacred use, meaning that all the profits from that farmland would go to the temple, right? And this, Jesus says, is contradicting the commandment to honor your father and mother, because apparently there were some people, some pious people who were getting around the need to take care of their parents by saying, well, I already dedicated it all to God, right? So they were not taking care of their elderly parents, and they were instead dedicating their profits to the temple. So Jesus says that they've made the commandment of God to honor your father and mother of no effect by your tradition of allowing this dedication of sacred things. So then Jesus continues, hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, and here he quotes Isaiah 29:13. These people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So here Jesus quotes Isaiah, this whole passage in Isaiah complains that people in Isaiah's day were outwardly religious, but inwardly far from God. And it goes on in the passage to criticize the folly of Israel's wise people, so they're religious leaders. All right, 15:10. When he had called the multitude to himself, he said to them, hear and understand. Not what goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth, this defiles a man. So this for the Orthodox is the most cited passage, I think, in the whole Bible. I don't know how many times I've had lay people cite this passage to me. It's like they know it, they know this passage like the back of their hand, because it's always an argument about for against fasting. Well, Father, it says, not what goes into the mouth defiles a man. What comes out of the mouth, this defiles a man. So is that what Jesus is really talking about here? Not exactly. What he's talking about is, he wants to say, well, here, we'll read on. Then his disciples came and said to him, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? Because the Pharisees had many rules about what you could eat, right? The kosher laws that Jews still keep, etc. But he answered and said, Jesus answered and said, every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into a ditch. So this image of uprooting, it's like weeding a garden. So whatever wasn't planted by the Father, who whatever wasn't planted by him from his seed as the farmer of this farmland, of this vineyard, which is Israel, which is the world, that will be uprooted, like being weeded out. And this is standard Old Testament judgment language here. And Jesus's point is that don't worry about the Pharisees' power and influence, because their day of judgment is coming. 15. And then Peter answered and said to him, Jesus, explain this parable to us. So Jesus said, are you also still without understanding? Meaning, like, just like the Pharisees, are you also not understanding this? Do you not yet understand that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and is eliminated? So this is a very kind of earthy image. In other words, food is not a matter of the heart, but simply of the body. And so it goes in one way and it comes out another way, and it doesn't have as much of an effect on you. But what's really important is the heart. 18. But those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. So he's saying, he's specifically talking about this tradition of eating with unwashed hands, which is one of the Pharisees' oral traditions. So he's not talking about fasting. All right. So then Jesus went out from there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. So here, Tyre and Sidon, so Jesus keeps kind of moving north. So Tyre and Sidon are at the very northern borders of Israel. And you get the sense here that they hope that they could find rest. Again, still looking for this rest that's eluding them, Jesus and the disciples. 22, and behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, have mercy on me, O Lord, son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed. But he answered her not a word. So again, Jesus and his disciples were tired and needed rest. They came to this kind of this place where they didn't think any Jews would be, right? Because the Canaanites, remember the Canaanites were the people that were driven out by Israel when they came into the Holy Land, and they were told by God to eliminate them completely, but they disobeyed and didn't do that. So the Canaanites actually ended up getting pushed north to the northern border of Israel, into Phoenicia. And the Canaanites were probably along with the Samaritans, the most despised of Israel's enemies, especially in the Old Testament. The Canaanites were enemies of the Jews. So here, Jesus and his disciples were tired, they needed rest, they wanted to be left alone, and here comes a Canaanite woman from this hated people. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she cries out after us." But she keeps crying out, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David." But he answered and said, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." So at this point, Jesus's mission is restricted to just Israel, right? And then elsewhere in the Gospels, when he first sends out the disciples as apostles, he sends them only to the house of Israel. So this is the unfolding of his plan. But at this point in his ministry, before his death and resurrection, he's aiming at the lost sheep of Israel. Then 25, then she came, and it says here in the New King James Version that the Orthodox Study Bible uses, then she came and worshiped him, saying, "Lord, help me." But actually the word there is proskino, which the Seventh Ecumenical Council made a great point of distinguishing from worship. So the word for worship is latreo. Proskino means to literally to bow down or to kneel down before somebody, right? Usually more like bow down before somebody, to prostrate yourself before somebody like you would do to a king at that time. So she came and she prostrated before him, indicating that he was someone to be respected and to be venerated. She came and worshiped him, saying, "Lord, help me." And then in 26, but he answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table." So this is a great, in the ancient world, these kind of witty responses were greatly appreciated. And here Jesus sees the humility, because to call somebody a dog in the ancient world, like it's not like in our day where dogs are kind of exalted as pets. In the ancient world, and even in Greece, I think to an extent to this day, in the Balkans, I noticed that dogs are, there's kind of stray dogs all over the place and wild dogs all over the place, and people tend to be afraid of dogs and see them as dirty. It's strange for Greeks to have dogs in the house as pets. It's changing a little bit now.
In Serbia, the same way,
Yeah.
because when Darko got here, that's what he said. He said, "Why do you have those animals in the house?"
Yeah, they think it's weird. So especially in the ancient world, when they didn't have excess food, generally speaking, they didn't really see dogs as pets. They saw them as pests. And to call somebody a dog was pretty much one of the worst insults you could say to somebody. So here she accepts the designation as a little dog and says, "But yes, yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table." And so this woman believed that Jesus, she's not asking him, notice that a lot of times when someone goes to Jesus, they ask him to come with them so that he can go and touch or heal somebody directly. But here she doesn't dare to ask him to do that, for this Jew to do that. She believes that he can just heal her daughter from afar with just a word. So this is great faith and humility. 28, then Jesus answered and said to her, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire." And her daughter was healed from that very hour. So remotely, Jesus doesn't have to go there. He heals her daughter. 29, Jesus departed from there, skirted the Sea of Galilee, and went up on the mountain and sat down there. So he went to the east of the Sea of Galilee, near the Gentile towns of the Decapolis, it was called. So this was an area mainly influenced by Greek culture, non-Jewish culture, but there were some Gentiles some Jews who lived there. So, but he goes there hoping to avoid the crowds of Jews. Nevertheless, he can't find rest anywhere because, what does it say in 30? Then great multitudes came to him, having with them the lame, blind, mute, maimed, and many others, and they laid them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. So the multitude marveled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed made whole, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. Now Jesus called his disciples to himself and said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. So when he says 3 days, the Jewish reckoning of days was that any part of a day counted as a day. So it could be that started in the afternoon of one day, went all day the next day, and then concluded the next morning. That would be 3 days, technically. So it's part or whole of 3 days. And he says, and I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way, because they were in a remote place. They had to walk a long way back to their homes. Then his disciples said to him, where could we get enough bread in the wilderness to fill such a great multitude? So, which is kind of an odd question, because they just had the first feeding of the 5,000, right? And they don't think to themselves, well, he can do it again. They think, where can we get enough bread? So they're worried about these very practical things. Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7 and a few little fish. So like in Greece today, still, sometimes they'll have plates of little fish, like almost like sardine, little fish, which isn't considered, nearly as nice as having, a big whole fish, but it's kind of like a hors d'oeuvre or something. And probably they were pickled little fish. So they don't have very much. 7 loaves of bread and a few little pickled sardines. 35. So he commanded the multitude to sit down or recline on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves and the fish and gave thanks, broke them, and gave them to his disciples. And the disciples gave to the multitude. So exactly the same order of things as the first feeding of the 5,000. So they all ate and were filled. So not only did they eat, but they were filled to full. Then they took up 7 large baskets full of the fragments that were left. So here the word for baskets, which they've translated as large basket, is a different word than small. Jews typically carried around like a small basket that they would carry in front of them like this, where you could carry some things from the field, etc. Here they're a large basket, which was large enough for a human being, for a man to fit in. So it was a very large basket, because it's the same word that's used when Paul is let down from the city walls of Damascus. He's let down in this word, and so it was big enough that it could fit Paul. So it was a very large basket, full of fragments that were left from these 7 loaves. So they ended up with more food than they began with, even after everyone was full. So it was a feast. It was a banquet, not just a snack. 38. Now those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And he sent away the multitude, got into the boat, and came to the region of Magdala. So Magdala, we don't know exactly where Magdala is, but we think it's on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, and that would be where Mary Magdalene was from, meaning Mary of Magdala, Mary from Magdala. So that's the end of 15. Now we go into the top of chapter 16. Then the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and testing him, asked that he would show them a sign from heaven. So again, the Pharisees and the Sadducees are probably coming from, some of them at least are coming from Jerusalem, which was their kind of headquarters. So there's a sense that they're kind of tracking Jesus, right? They're watching him. And the fact that it's the Pharisees and the Sadducees together, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were 2 rival parties. It was like the Democrats and the Republicans or something like that. So the fact that they came together to try to catch Jesus is amazing, that they would find a common cause, because they had nothing in common. They were at odds constantly. But here they come together to root out Jesus. Yeah.
Were there Sadducees outside of Jerusalem?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it seems odd because the Sadducees were generally the priestly class, and so they
Right.
would be attached to the temple in
But
Jerusalem.
Pharisees could be in the
Anywhere.
village, yeah.
Yeah,
That's what I think it must have been a field trip for them.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you would think that, so anyone who is a member of the tribe of Levi through Aaron and the priest Zadok was considered a priest. So, I mean, theoretically, they could live anywhere, but practically they had to live somewhere near Jerusalem. Although technically there were so many priests that they only served one fortnight, 2 weeks out of every year. So, I mean, if you only have to serve every 2 weeks out of every year, you could live somewhere far away. It's possible, but
Well,
more,
maybe they were following him to try to catch him
yeah,
doing something.
that's exactly what I think we're supposed to infer that. And they asked him that he would show them a sign from heaven, like the prophets did. He answered and said to them, when it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and threatening. So he was talking about how they typically predicted the weather for the next day. Hypocrites, he says, you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you cannot discern the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and departed. So they're trying to catch him. He gives them this kind of, he doesn't give them what they're looking for. And he says the only sign that will be given is the sign of the prophet Jonah, which we understand to be his death and resurrection. But at the time, probably nobody understood what he was talking about. Now,
But I don't know.
Can I enter? Yeah, may I?
You did with the bread and everything,
Yeah.
how are they gonna understand just the words?
yeah.
Well, I was thinking of the father of John the Baptist. They were in the town of Ain Karim, and remember Zechariah was called upon to serve. He'd been waiting all years to actually burn incense, and so he was one of those priests. And Ain Karim was not really that close to Jerusalem, but it was his duty to come, if you remember. And finally, the lot fell on him to be able to go in and burn incense. That's when the angel Gabriel appeared to him. But that stayed with me, the fact that many priests lived around Jerusalem in towns like in Ain Karim, Beit Jaffe, Bethany. You know, they probably lived in the area surrounding Jerusalem. And when they were called for the duty, they came in for that duty and then went back.
Yeah, and from what I've read, there were two different classes of priests too. There were what they call in the Gospels the chief priests, the ones who had rank, who had authority, who had influence, who probably lived in Jerusalem. They tended to be very wealthy, and they lived in the wealthiest part of Jerusalem, up on the hill. But there was also many priests who were poor, who probably couldn't afford to live in Jerusalem.
Yes.
16:5. Now, when his disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. Then Jesus said to them, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So Jewish tradition sometimes used yeast to symbolize evil. Most fundamentally, it was something that spreads. So we might use an analogy now with more medical scientific knowledge. We might say like a virus or a cancer, right? Something like that. This is what he compares the Pharisees and the Sadducees teaching to. And in Aramaic, the word for yeast or leaven, amira, and teaching, amira, were spelled differently but pronounced the same. Nezra, do you know in Arabic, does that still apply?
The same thing, Hamira.
Yeah, amira. There you go. So Jesus is making a play on words here. When he says, beware the leaven or yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, he's really saying, beware of their teaching. But it sounds like he's saying, beware of the yeast. And then it goes on to say in 16:7, and the disciples reasoned among themselves, saying, it is because we've taken no bread. So they think that he's warning them about this because they've not taken bread, and so they think that he's saying, don't eat the bread of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, eat your own bread. And so this is what they initially think, but 16:8, but Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, "Oh, you of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves because you have brought no bread? Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up? Nor the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many large baskets you took up? How is it you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees?" Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. 13.
That ends with doctrine and bread in it in Aramaic. Would that be the same word?
Yeah, teaching doctrine, yeah.
Wow.
So he makes a play on words, and of course, as usual, the disciples are confused until he explains it. 16:13. When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" So after talking about the blindness of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, we're going to see here in this scene that the apostles are beginning to see. They're beginning to come out of their own blindness. So he takes them far north to the Gentile town of Caesarea Philippi. You can tell by the name of the town, Caesarea Philippi, that it's a Roman town, and it's far north. And he takes them there. It's not clear why, because few Jewish people would have expected this to be a site for a divine revelation, because in Caesarea Philippi was pagan territory. There was a grotto, a shrine devoted to the worship of the Greek deity Pan. Herod had also dedicated a temple for the worship of Caesar there. So this is an unlikely non-Jewish place for Jesus to bring the disciples and for this most important revelation that's about to happen to take place. So the city,
headquarters, Father, this was the headquarters for the Roman seat. It was
Right.
the Roman seat. So that it's on the Mediterranean. It's still there when you go and see. It's a fabulous, the ruins are beautiful. And so it was basically Roman.
yeah. So an unusual place for Jesus to bring his disciples. It was about 25 miles north of the Lake Sea of Galilee and about 1,700 feet higher up in elevation.
Looks like it's in the mountains.
And it lay near the source of the Jordan of the Old Testament tribe of Dan, which was the northern boundary of ancient Israel. So he asks them, who do people say that I am? 14. So they said, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah, one of the prophets. So all of these answers, and you can almost get the sense that the disciples are reporting this maybe with a little laugh, well, some say you're this, some say that. And all these answers about who Jesus is fall into the prophets category. Though many members of the Jewish elite believe that prophets had ceased in Israel, popular expectation of end time prophets remained strong. So Elijah was expected to return, according to Malachi 4:5, and many of Jesus's miracles resembled Elijah's and Elisha's. His judgment oracles in Matthew 11, or his downplaying of the temple may have evoked the comparison with Jeremiah. So this is why some people see John the Baptist, some Elijah or Elisha, other prophets. Some see Jeremiah and his kind of gloom and doom predictions. 16:15. Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." So here we have this in Mark's gospel. This takes place exactly in the middle of Mark's gospel. And in Matthew's gospel, it's a little past the middle because there's so much more teaching in Matthew. But here, this is a turning point in the story. Finally, Simon is the first to understand who Jesus really is. So there's this divine revelation, and Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, Simon, son of Jonah, son of John. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter," and Peter, of course, Petros means rock. some people want to translate this more literally as, and I also say to you that you are rocky. And on this rock, I will build my church, to make the play in words clear, but Rocky doesn't sound like a good name for Peter. Saint Rocky doesn't sound right. And so I say that you are Peter, Petros, and on this rock, Petra, I will build my church, Ecclesia, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. So it's not Peter who's the rock, but it's Peter's confession that is his confession of faith in Jesus. That's the, yeah.
I've read an article about this sentence, and they're outside Caesarea Philippi looking at this pagan temple, which is in the base of a cliff, it's huge
Yeah.
rock, and the River Jordan's coming out of this temple of Pan, which is a cave, which the pagans thought were the gates of hell. So
Yes.
this scholar thought, well, maybe he's looking at this very thing and saying this at the same time, and we don't know. But
That's good, yeah, that's good.
all this imagery was present in
Yeah.
Greek.
Yeah, because they did believe that, that Hades was really literally underground, right? So and then there were these places where there was this one place, I forget if it was Caesarea Philippi, I forget where it was, but there was one place where they actually had gates closing off a cave that went underground.
Yeah.
So I think it might have been there that this was. And so he's literally talking about gates, the gates of Hades, as they believed in it. And this is the first time in Matthew that he uses the word church, ecclesia, which is the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the official Greek translation of the Old Testament that Jesus and Paul would have all known and used, this Greek translation, which is there in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, church, ecclesia, translates the Hebrew word kahal, which means a gathering or assembly. And when they talk about it in the Old Testament, it's an official kind of thing, the kahal of Israel, the assembly of Israel. It's this official body, this official gathering, official assembly. And the gates of Hades means the power of death. In other words, the church would stand eternally against the inward and outward attacks of Satan. Then Jesus says to Peter, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So the binding and loosening are a symbol of rabbinic authority. So the rabbis, the religious leaders of Israel, could bind or loosen something, meaning that they could, their interpretation of the law, they could bind something and say, you must do this according to the law, or they could loosen it and saying you're free to do whatever you want. In this case, there's no commandment in the law on this. But also it referred to sins, because sins were transgressions of the law. So you could also bind or loose sins, which Jesus talks about specifically later. Meaning you could hold the sin against the person, or you could forgive it. And
That's
keys,
repeated really, Father, and when he appeared to them after the resurrection, these are the same words he repeated to them. Whoever sins you bind will be bound, and whoever sins you loosen, it will be loose. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of a repetition of that same sentence.
right, and that's important because, and even in Matthew, actually, in chapter 18, he's going to repeat that even before the resurrection. In chapter 18, I think verse 18, he repeats it, but he applies it to all the disciples. So he says the same thing one time, singling out Peter, but then the next time in just 2 chapters, he says it to all the disciples. So this is the Orthodox response to, of course, the Catholics, we hear a lot about them in the news right now with the death of the Pope, and the Pope as this sitting on Peter's seat. The Catholics will tend to take this passage and really magnify it. This is the one they know, the passage they know like the back of their hand. But the fact that Jesus repeats it and extends it to all the disciples is the Orthodox interpretation, that it's not just Peter. Yeah.
Have you talked to some Protestants about these verses? Because it seemed like the gates of hell would not prevail against the church. How did it disappear?
Yes.
Until their leader came along and resurrected it, and then, of course, priests forgiving sins, or,
Right,
I mean, it's like these don't exist.
yeah,
They just ignore them.
yeah, I actually had somebody, a parishioner, call me the other day, and he's kind of gotten into this relationship with somebody, and their friends are staunch fundamentalist Protestants, and they've been kind of attacking him on his Orthodox faith, saying it's not a Bible-based religion, da 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 da. And he was, he'll send me things and say, well, how do I respond to this? And how do I respond to this attack and this attack? And finally, I said to him, really, if you want to try to have a conversation with him, turn the focus to the church. Because, the scriptures are clear, like in 1 Timothy 3:15, it says the church is the pillar and the ground of truth. Jesus came and he founded a church. And so why wouldn't you want to be part of that church that Jesus came specifically to found, right? But they don't think in terms of the church. They just think in terms of individuals. But I think for all of us, if you find yourself having to defend your Greek Orthodox faith, you could point to the passages exactly that point to the church and say, Jesus founded a church. I want to be a member of it. Okay, and then the keys, the image of the keys. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. So remember, in the ancient world, the keys were not like we're used to keys being small. Keys were big things. Like even in Greece today, in my parish in the village, the old chapels from the 1700s, they all had keys that were like this big, that I couldn't keep them in my pocket, so I had to have a special box that I kept them in my office, and it had a little key that opened the box. But it was interesting, these old 200-300-year-old keys. But so the keeper of the keys was an important role that a household servant could have. So the keys were bulky, they couldn't be mass produced. It's not like everyone could have a copy of the key. So there was one person who was the key holder, right? And he was usually like the top servant in the household. He had the authority to carry the keys and let people in and out. And so the image of someone holding keys symbolized authority. So like a high official held the keys in a royal kingdom, and in God's house, the temple, someone in a high position had the keys to it. All right. Yeah, and then 16:20. Then he commanded his disciples that he should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. So most people in Israel at this time still thought in worldly military terms about the Messiah. So that, they thought that the Messiah was going to be this kind of revolutionary military figure who was going to lead them in a military revolt against Rome and throw off the Roman overlords. But Jesus recognizes that if his claims came out now, that Peter has recognized you are the Son of God, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, great, you recognize the truth, and you will be given positions of authority in my kingdom, but don't tell anybody about this, because if it come out now, before his hour, before the time, before he came time for him to die and be resurrected, then it would cause all sorts of problems, and it could spark an open rebellion against Rome, which he didn't want. So he tells them to tell no one that he was really the Messiah. So that's all I had prepared for today. That brings us close to the end of 16. We're going to enter into a new section in the next verse, so it's better to pick that up next time. We got 2 minutes left. If anybody has any questions or comments.
Father,
Yeah,
Mark, now did Matthew take a lot of the info? Mark was the first gospel written, from what I understand, and
yes,
of course it has less information, while Matthew really has a lot more detail about the teachings of
yes.
Christ and the miracles and and instructions to us. Can you elaborate on that? Where Mark and Matthew are similar. I know that Matthew wrote to the Jewish people mainly, but since Mark was the first, was Mark just recording incidents, or did he have a focus towards?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Good question, yeah, so there's a big debate, so the church always believed that Matthew was written first, which is why it comes first. They ordered the gospels in the order in which they thought they were written, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. But modern day scholars think that probably that order is correct, basically, but that Mark came before Matthew. And there's still a debate about that, but most scholars, which, take that with a grain of salt, they think that Mark was first. And Mark shows, Mark doesn't have nearly as much teaching as Jesus. His is more an action-packed kind of, he uses the word immediately all the time. Immediately Jesus did this, immediately. So his is more this kind of action-based. It records all of his miracles, it records his 2 miraculous feedings, but it doesn't have a lot of the teaching. And they say that Mark was a disciple or companion of Peter. And so that Mark's gospel is really Peter's account. And Mark was writing for the Romans mainly. He was writing not necessarily to the Jews. Matthew comes along, and the scholars think that Matthew and Luke come along, and they both have access to Mark. They both know the text of Mark. They probably even have the text of Mark in front of them. And they also have this other source that's been lost to history called Q. It's called Q by scholars, meaning for quell, German word for source, and that this Q document had all this teaching of Jesus without the narrative, without much of the narrative. And so Matthew, they say, took Mark and Q and combined them in accordance with this oral tradition that he also received. So that's the modern scholar's view. The church tended to think that Matthew was first, and that Mark simplified the gospel. That he purposely took out some of the teaching material and made it more of an action-packed kind of a story, a narrative that would be more appealing to readers in that genre, right? We're used to stories about the action of God figures.
That Q gospel theory sounds kind of bogus to me because they disregard oral tradition, which they
Right.
both could have been from the oral. I mean,
Yeah.
John Mark wasn't even there for part of this.
Right.
Well, Mark was not a disciple, and so he must have
No.
gotten a lot of his information from Peter, because he was
Yeah.
not he was a young man. And I know that St. Paul took Mark the first missionary journey with him and with Barnabas, John Mark, and then he left. But the fact that he wrote, although he was not a disciple, so he got his information from those that were companions of Jesus, like Peter and Matthew and others. It's strange for me that he was the one who wrote one of the gospels when he was not a disciple, but must have been a companion of them, and not necessarily a witness to all these miracles that Jesus did.
Right, yeah, it's coming from oral tradition, a lot of it. The modern scholars are very textual based because that's how we are in the Enlightenment. We're very focused on the text, and then we kind of disregard oral tradition. But the scholars they look at the text side by side. Like if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side, you can see that it's like word for word agreement, not just general agreement. So that's what makes them think that there must have been some text, because otherwise, how could they be so exact? But that overlooks the fact that oral tradition was actually very reliable and was very consistent. So it's not impossible that it was from oral tradition. But anyway, the truth is probably more complicated, because the fathers of the church, the early fathers of the church, mentioned that there was a Hebrew, meaning possibly Hebrew or Aramaic, a Hebrew version of Matthew. And some also refer to a Hebrew version of John. So that some think that John, there might have been a very early version of John. Some think that he might have actually been the first gospel written, not the last, but that it was an early version of it that then gets translated into Greek. So the whole question of which came first is really complicated, but probably it was Matthew or Mark came first, and Luke and the final version of John came later.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Father.
See you next
Thank
week.
you.
We'll pick up